Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. So, $80 Mario Kart. This game has been the subject of much heated discussion since it was first announced, especially after people learned of the price tag, after having to search for it once the Switch 2 Direct was over. But before we address those concerns, I think it's important that we first look to see exactly what the game has to say for itself. Setting aside the $80 price point if bought separately, or the $50 price point if bundled with the Switch 2, is it a fun game? So we'll answer that, then we'll get to the elephant in the room. At its core, the game is still Mario Kart. You pick a character in kart, have your Grand Prix, time trials, versus mode, battle mode, online stuff, pretty much everything you'd expect from a Mario Kart game is here. So, rather than summarizing what all of that means, let's just jump in and look at what's different from prior iterations. First of all, the big selling point of this one is that all of the tracks exist on the same giant map. What this allows for are a couple of new game modes, and for a major change to the Grand Prix mode. Rather than just having individual tracks you do 3 laps on, with some exceptions, every race after the first typically only has 1 lap around the actual track, with the rest of the distance being the drive over to that particular course. In theory, this is a really cool idea, as you get to watch the landscape shift as you move along, and hear the music change as you cross certain points, instead of exclusively doing the usual speed up tempo on final lap bit. It also means you can set up a lot of varying pathways yourself, going back and forth between different racetracks in the versus mode. However, this leads into the biggest drawback for the game, the fact that there's only so many ways you can vary up the drive to a particular track. Not to say there's no attempt to vary it up, as you'll have some roads that are more winding, others with a lot of traffic you have to weave through, and a case where if you're going uphill, you have to deal with switchbacks, but going downhill you can have a bunch of airtime and boosts, and that's all without considering the solid visual variety. That said, these can only go so far, as in practice there can still be long stretches where you're holding forward without much else going on. They did introduce a spin on the drift, where you can reduce your turn speed in favor of getting a small jump and a boost, though the boost isn't the main reason you go for it given how small said boost is. Even if it made a major difference though, repeating the same rhythmic button press isn't a much better alternative to just holding A. The end result is a game that, even though it isn't substantially slower or faster than 8, can feel slower at certain points, especially if you're using 50cc to get a sense for the tracks before kicking it up a notch. That's one of the major caveats that needs to be said, as while the original Grand Prix experience can still be obtained, you have to either go digging in the versus mode or a friend's lobby, or hit random when racing online, to ensure you only race on the designated track. And since there's no trophy from doing well in either case, it's not something I expect would get a lot of attention. Perhaps if there were a classic mode added in that's harder to unlock than the mirror mode was, that would have been a welcome addition for the core audience, but let's be honest, this is Nintendo we're talking about here. When they commit to an idea, their mindset is that you'll take their gimmicks and like them, so it's unlikely we'd ever see that added in. They didn't put all this work into the big open world only for us to pick a mode that doesn't even take advantage of it. We even have evidence of this with an update that made the online mode workaround less effective, by mixing in intermission tracks among the random selection. As another major difference, the races now have 24 racers instead of 12, which sounds like it'd be really cool, but that's another thing I'm hesitant on. Because there's now double the number of racers, I remember joking about how that would mean twice the number of blue shells. As you would hope though, the number of blue shells seem to be about the same as before, as then the already substantial rubber banding would be even worse. What that also means is that there's less power-up variety for a given individual, which also means less instances where you get power stars or bullet bills, to say nothing as to how bullet bills have been nerfed. About the only times I saw them were in multiplayer, since I am definitely more casual compared to the people who will min-max stuff like the time trial, and in the mode we're about to discuss, because there are slowly less racers in that mode, and therefore more opportunities for the good stuff. Instead, the most frequent rare items seem to be giant shrooms and golden shrooms, which are certainly useful for taking advantage of shortcuts, but aren't the most visually interesting, especially when the real fun to be had on straightaways comes from hamstringing everyone else. Speaking of hamstringing everyone else on straightaways, Knockout Tour. That's one of the new modes enabled by the interconnected world, as you get a single pathway that's broken up by 6 laps, with each marker removing the bottom 4 racers from the competition. Avoiding the 20 racer threshold isn't too difficult, but it can start to be a nail-biter once you get into the 12, then 8, then 4 racer thresholds. While it does have the same problem of too many straightaways as the Grand Prix, the fact that there's a constant pressure to not just hang out in the back until the leader gets blue shelled adds a decent amount of tension to it, to where you only notice the issue if you manage to gain a substantial lead. Though even then, this is still Mario Kart, so there are still cases where you're leading the crowd for most of it, only to get knocked down to 4th at the last minute. And then there's the other new game mode, Free Roam. Before we get too far on this topic, allow me to make my bias clear. I hate open world games. A large part of that is due to game balance for open world games with progression systems being near impossible to get right, which thankfully doesn't apply here. The part that does apply here is how repetitive the genre can be. Oh, here's this big open world where there's all sorts of stuff to do, but we're only going to add a few meaningful differences between activities and repeat them ad nauseum because, let's be honest, you're eventually going to grow bored and complete the main story before seeing to it all. I'd much rather have a tight 6-hour experience than a repetitive 12-hour experience. And whenever I've liked a game with open world elements, it was in spite of those elements, not because of them. Looking to Mario Kart World's free roam, there's only 3 meaningful activities: see the sights, find P-switches for mini-challenges, and find collectibles, whether they be question mark tiles, costumes that can also be obtained in normal gameplay, Peach medallions, or piles of coins. The former is also partially obtained from just playing the other game modes, so that alone isn't going to buoy up the game by itself. The collectibles are the ostensible reason for going off the beaten path, which feeds into the exploration aspect, but isn't something I found myself wanting to do for long stretches. The P-switches then became the main draw for me, as the challenges can then make me think of how best to use the new mechanics to efficiently move through an area, and there is a decent amount of variety between them. As part of that, not only are you able to grind on rails and wires, you can also use the straightaway drift to jump onto and start driving on walls. In fact, that's likely the main reason the straightaway drift is here, as while the boost isn't substantial, it also lets you do the ground equivalent of a barrel roll, which makes it easier to get up onto a railway or wall you wish to grind or drive on. On that count, it's a neat addition, which even if I don't feel a strong urge to perfect during races, the P-switches take full advantage of it. It also takes full advantage of something I was really nervous about when I saw it announced, specifically the rewind feature. Letting us go back and avoid missing a jump or what have you, that could absolutely trivialize the game if mishandled. Fortunately, it's only really useful in free roam, as it completely kills your momentum, doesn't stop time from moving forward, and doesn't rewind the timer on the current P-switch challenge. Because of that, it's only useful for resetting your position to try making it to a question mark tile or Peach medallion, which in that case is greatly appreciated, and wasn't something I even thought to bust out during a Grand Prix or Knockout tour. That said, because of my hatred for open world elements, there's the cynical part of me that wishes I could just have these challenges laid out in a menu where I can leaf through them, and try out particular ones at my leisure. If I feel like doing a blue coin challenge, I can't just pick one and go. I have to go hunting for it, and hope the particular P-switch I chose will be one. Also, while the ones you've completed are grayed out, there's also no way to tell how many P-switches are left. Even if you compel us to explore for them, I could live with that, but I'd like to be able to replay them from a menu instead of having to seek out the ones I particularly like. With those as our new game modes, the next topic is to look at all the little changes that have been made. The item you have ready to go is now automatically carried behind you, so no need to hold down a button for an indeterminate period if you want to protect against a red shell. If you move to a water section where you're jumping in rather than driving from the shoreline, you'll dip into the water a bit, which makes sense from a physics standpoint and can be used to give a small boost as well. Different hazards and power-ups will affect your momentum in unique ways now. Lightning stops you dead in your tracks rather than having you skid, though it doesn't keep you shrunk for as long anymore. If only a corner of your vehicle or the side of it hits an obstacle, it's more likely that it bounces off a bit rather than losing a bunch of momentum. And even if you careen headlong into smaller vehicles, you still bounce forward a bit, while only losing part of your momentum. As a result, there can be a gradient between the minor inconveniences like the small vehicles versus the dangerous items like lightning and blue shells, which adds a nice bit of visual variety and helps the really punishing stuff to stand out more. Even if I could stand for the blue shells to not stand out so much, I was about to win this one, dang it! Good thing I had done well enough on the prior stuff to still get gold on that Grand Prix. And speaking of the visuals, this game is a really nice looker. It doesn't matter whether I'm looking at the preview window of my capture card, my old TV in the basement, or even in handheld mode, there's enough detail to the textures and character models to be striking, without it being so detailed that it becomes distracting. And side note, since this is the Switch 2's launch title, the screen on this thing is spectacular. You wouldn't know this is an LCD screen with how vibrant it is, and man does having it be a 1080p screen over a 720p make a major difference there. Pretty much everywhere looks great, on whatever screen you use, with this game's version of Rainbow Road being my new favorite. They vary up the track a lot this time around, and justify it by making it effectively a one-lap course, which means even in a Grand Prix, it's one of the few cases where you get to experience the excellent track design without having to compromise by going into versus mode. It makes perfect sense why they couldn't get this to work on Switch 1 hardware, because they would have had to make serious compromises to keep this running at 60 FPS on same. That said, not every change is overly positive. I've mentioned rubber banding already, and it is really severe in this game. You can go from 1st to 12th to 3rd within seconds due to the amount of items being thrown around, and depending on how lucky you get with your own. I could be doing terribly on a knockout tour, suddenly get bullet bill into golden shroom, and I'm back to a really good place, only to then get knocked down with a pair of red shells back to back or something crazy like that. What makes this more pronounced is that the AI is not messing around this time. I was able to consistently get first in Grand Prix the last time I played 8 in 150cc, but it took a fair amount of getting familiar with the unique quirks of this game, unlocking some karts with a high top speed, picking a racer who also increases your top speed a little, and then I could consistently get to at least 4th. You wouldn't expect there to be a major learning curve despite that, but in my case, I was using motion controls, as Mario Kart Wii was the first Mario Kart game my family owned, to where I only completely abandoned motion controls in handheld mode. I mention this because they seem a lot more sensitive this time around, regardless of whether I'm using my Switch 1 Pro controller or the Switch 2 Joy-Cons, in either configuration. Even after growing used to it, there's still occasional times I get conscious of it and start weaving around like I'm drunk. Heck, the margin of error in general seems to be less than before, as I have to be much more explicit with the left analog when saying, "Oi, throw the green shell behind me, not..." And you thought I wasn't giving you enough of a hint, didn't you? And I thought I was dense. Apart from that, you have the time trials and battle mode both returning, which aren't a major reason why I play. I'm not the type to min-max my way through a particular track, though as a way to appreciate the track design, the time trials are certainly useful in that respect, and having a ghost to compare against can be useful to see where the good spots for boost shrooms are. The battle mode also isn't anything to write home about, as you've got the balloon battle, which now takes you out of the round if you lose every balloon and zeroes out your score for that round, and the coin battle, where you can go from winning to 10th in a hurry depending on how much people gang up on you. And that's pretty much it, because I guess stuff like Bomb Blast or Renegade Roundup would have been too chaotic with 24 people or something. Still, even if there may be some rough edges from the change in direction, and points that you wish might have been a bit more fleshed out like the free roam and battle mode, it's still Mario Kart. It's still a game that's easy to pick up and play regardless of skill level, with just enough skill involved with things like drift for there to be a meaningful difference in efficacy, but also a lot of random luck to ensure that even someone inexperienced can pick it up and still have a grand old time ruining your day. A bit of an odd game to have as a launch title, but I'd say it does a good job at demonstrating what the Switch 2 is capable of, and for what I paid for it, it's been a nice game to go a few rounds with after work. So, now comes the elephant in the room. Having said all of this about the game, let's talk about the price. Originally, I didn't plan on going anywhere near this game, precisely because of it. However, a friend was quite eager to get a hold of the Switch 2, and first got a pre-order with the game bundled in from one retailer, which would arrive the day after release, but then realized he could go to another for a midnight release, and secured a second pre-order from there. Since he now had 2 pre-orders, he asked if I wanted the first one he secured. I thought about it, said, I'll give the new Mario Kart a chance at 50, and sent him the amount to cover the cost. I also threw in some homemade fudge as a finder's fee since I knew he went through a decent amount of trouble to get it. So, having bought it at 50, knowing what I do now, would I have recommended someone like me to get it at full price? No. There is a lot to like, and a lot of neat additions, but the fact that you're charging $80 means that people are going to expect this to be immaculate. To give a point of comparison, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe with its Booster Course DLC is asking $85 in total for a metric ton of courses. That is the point of comparison that basically everyone is going to make for Mario Kart World, as that's what we've gotten used to. It may not be a fair comparison, as 8 Deluxe has had the entire lifespan of both the Switch and Wii U to build that up, but that's been the de facto Mario Kart for over a decade, so comparisons to it are inevitable. Since they couldn't reasonably include that many stages and still have their open world gimmick, what's present here would need to be absolutely perfect to justify a comparable price to the complete prior gen offering. Given the caveats I made regarding the longer stretches of fairly straight paths, and due to the amount of rubber banding from there being 24 racers now, that's sadly not the case here. The Knockout Tour helps a lot, and if you don't mind what I mentioned regarding the free roam, that will also help a lot, but for me personally, I can't recommend this at full price. At the bundled price, I've gotten my money's worth from it, to where I would have been content to pay $60. But if I had to pay $80 for it, then I could make do with Mario Kart 8 being the party game if I have friends over. Now that we're at this point, let's talk about game prices in general. How likely are we to see $80 become the norm? Well, if Microsoft's pricing of The Outer Worlds 2 is anything to go by, the attempt is certainly being made to push for that, now that Nintendo has crossed the $80 Rubicon. According to Nintendo, they're spinning it as variable pricing, which when you look at how they price DLC, and compare that to how they priced the Metroid Prime remaster, I suppose it lines up with how they've acted up to now, full price remasters notwithstanding. It also seems as if it'll be a while before the $80 price point is seen for everything, as right now we effectively only have it for 2 games, Tears of the Kingdom Switch 2 Edition and Mario Kart World. Everything else that's been announced which we have a price for is $70, whether it be Donkey Kong Bonanza or the Switch 2 edition of Pokemon Legends ZA. In fact, there's a cynical part of me that wonders if they charged $80 as the sacrificial lamb to make $70 easier to swallow. The real concern for me is not necessarily the original asking price, but whether we'll also have to worry about DLC on top of that. I would be shocked if either Mario Kart World or Pokemon Legends ZA got DLC, the former due to its design not really lending itself to DLC, and the latter because Legends Arceus didn't get any. To some extent, we've been at the point where we pay $80 for our video games for a long time, the difference being that the extra $20 or $30 is for an add-on for something we're already invested in. Fire Emblem Three Houses was effectively an $85 game for me because I was invested enough to want the DLC, while Fire Emblem Engage was effectively only $60 because I didn't like its story enough to justify throwing any more money at it. We could go back and forth on whether we prefer the upfront asking price being higher or with there being DLC we can choose to pick up later, as there's benefits and pitfalls to both. What concerns me is if and when we see a day where Nintendo thinks, hey, we have this big game like Breath of the Wild for our fancy new Switch. Let's not only charge $80 up front, but ask for a $30 expansion pass on top of that. And don't think they wouldn't do it either. They've been slowly increasing the price of their expansion passes since Breath of the Wild. Time will tell as to how it plays out, so for now, all I can say for certain is that the next time Nintendo tries to sell us an $80 game will be fascinating to watch unfold. Mario Kart World has the advantage of a $50 price point when bundled with the Switch 2, but when a game is put out there that doesn't have such a failsafe, how well would it do? There will certainly be the hardcore crowd that pays for it, or the casual audience that doesn't think too hard on it, but will that crowd be enough to offset those put off by the price? Here's hoping that, whatever the answer to that question, that the games industry will come out the other side better for it. With that said, that's all I have for this video, and thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for more reviews as well as other content posted on a semi-regular basis. As far as more Switch 2 reviews, the upcoming Donkey Kong game looks promising, though given my lack of expertise, at most it'll likely just be a streamed game on another channel. The next game you'll likely hear from me over here is either Metroid Prime 4 or Pokemon Legends ZA, depending on the timing. My focus the last few months has been on long-term stuff. In one case, anticipating the end of Windows 10 support and seeing how much of my game library survives the jump to Linux, and in another, taking a microscope to Fire Emblem Engage. It's going to be a busy few months to get all that sorted, and to make sure it goes smoothly, I better jump back into my test OS and keep working through that. Until next time, thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you all later.